I want you to picture this moment clearly. Streets filling with anger, an economy collapsing in real time, and a US president issuing direct warnings while protests are still burning. Iran has seen unrest before, but this is different. This time, the pressure is coming from every direction at once. For 9 days, demonstrators have stayed on the streets as inflation soars, food prices explode, and a national currency loses nearly all credibility. At the same time, President Trump is publicly warning Iran's leaders, saying the US is locked and loaded. That kind of language, delivered mid-protest, is rare, and it matters. Because it changes calculations. It shifts fear. It tells people watching from their phones and their rooftops that power may no longer be untouchable. More than 20 people are already dead. Security forces are responding with force. And yet, the protests are spreading. If you want to understand why this moment feels more dangerous than 2022, stay with me. Because to see where Iran is headed, we need to understand how it got this fragile in the first place. What you're seeing on Iran's streets is not a single protest. It's the collision of multiple crises that have been quietly building for years, now breaking at the same time. On the surface, this began as an economic revolt. Inflation officially sits above 40%, food prices are rising at more than 70%, some basic goods have doubled in price. The national currency has lost roughly 80% of its value in just 1 year. For millions of Iranians, daily life has become a constant calculation of survival. But economics alone doesn't explain why slogans turned political so quickly, or why chants now target the entire system, not just the government of the day. Beneath the price hikes is something deeper, a collapse of trust. A belief that the rules no longer apply equally. That while ordinary people absorb the pain, a small elite finds ways to profit from sanctions, control trade, and move money abroad. When hardship feels engineered, anger hardens. And once that happens, repression becomes far less effective. To understand how Iran reached this breaking point, we have to step back and look at the machinery that brought it here. For decades, Iran's political system was built to absorb pressure, not collapse under it. Economic pain, social limits, even international isolation were all framed as manageable costs of resistance. But that model only works as long as the system can still deliver stability. That stability was financed through oil, enforced through security, and justified through ideology. Sanctions came and went, but Iran developed ways around them. Shadow banking networks, controlled imports and exports, trusted regional partners. Over time, this created a parallel economy, one that rewarded loyalty and access rather than productivity or transparency. And that's where the cycle turned toxic. As sanctions tightened, opportunities narrowed. Control concentrated. Those with connections survived, even prospered. Those without fell behind. Inflation stopped being temporary. Currency devaluation stopped being cyclical. It became structural. When merchants in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shut their shops, that was not symbolic. It was historic. The bazaar has long been a backbone of the system. When it moves, it signals something deeper is wrong. By the time students and small businesses joined in, the protests were no longer about prices. They were about legitimacy. And that set the stage for the first shock the system did not see coming. The first rupture came when the protests crossed a line the state has always feared most: coordination across class and geography. What began with merchants and students stopped looking local. Demonstrations spread from Tehran to smaller cities and towns. Economic chants hardened into political demands. And within days, slogans calling for the removal of the entire Islamic Republic returned to the streets. That moment mattered, because once a protest challenges the system itself, there is no easy off-ramp. Security forces moved fast and violently. Human rights groups report more than 20 deaths. Arrests mounted. Internet access tightened. The familiar tools of control were deployed almost automatically. But something was different this time. The fear did not fully settle back in. Then came Washington. While protests were still unfolding, President Trump issued direct warnings to Iran's leadership, saying the United States was locked and loaded. Not after the unrest, not quietly through diplomats, but publicly, in real time. That kind of message, delivered mid-crisis, doesn't just target governments, it speaks to people watching from the streets. If you're trying to understand why this protest refuses to fade, remember this moment. Because once outside pressure and internal anger begin to reinforce each other, systems start to crack. And beneath the surface, a far more dangerous mechanism was already at work. Here's the part that rarely makes it into official statements, but everyone inside Iran understands. Sanctions did not just weaken the economy, they reshaped power. Over time, access became more valuable than skill. Connections mattered more than productivity. A class of insiders emerged, controlling imports, exports, currency exchanges, and oil revenue channels that bypassed formal oversight. Many Iranians call them sanctions profiteers. Even government officials privately acknowledge their role. These networks thrive in opacity. They benefit when the rial collapses, when shortages hit, when ordinary people lose purchasing power. Crisis is not a failure for them. It's a business model. That's why anger didn't stop at Washington. It turned inward. Protesters weren't just blaming the United States. They were accusing their own leaders of exploiting the suffering, of protecting insiders while preaching resistance. And once that belief takes hold, legitimacy erodes fast. Now, add another layer. Iran's ability to move oil revenues abroad has narrowed. Financial routes tied to regional allies and distant markets are under pressure. When those channels weaken, the system loses its last shock absorbers. This is what makes the current unrest uniquely dangerous. Because when economic pain, elite capture, and shrinking external options collide, repression becomes costlier and less reliable. And then another crisis hit. The second shock didn't come from the streets. It came from the map. The 12-day war in the summer of 2025 between Iran and Israel changed everything. For the first time, the conflict crossed red lines that had held for decades. The United States became directly involved. Iranian nuclear facilities were struck. Military and industrial sites were damaged. Iran's defense capacity took a visible hit. At the same time, Tehran's regional safety net began to unravel. Bashar al-Assad's fall in Syria removed a critical ally. Israeli strikes hollowed out Hezbollah's leadership in Lebanon. Years of investment in proxy power suddenly looked fragile, even exposed. Then came Venezuela. The U.S. operation that seized Nicolas Maduro and his wife sent a message far beyond Caracas. It demonstrated reach, speed, willingness. And for Tehran, it narrowed the margin for error even further. Iran relies on complex oil and financial arrangements tied to distant markets and unstable partners. As those networks fracture, economic pressure at home intensifies. Fewer allies, fewer channels, less room to maneuver. This is why today feels different. Iran is facing internal unrest while its external defenses are weakened at the same time. And when a state loses both its buffers, the consequences don't stay abstract. If you're watching this from the outside, it's easy to talk about strategy, sanctions, or geopolitics. But if you're inside Iran, this crisis isn't theoretical, it's personal. Imagine waking up each day knowing your salary is worth less than it was yesterday, watching food prices jump again, standing in line, recalculating what you can afford, what you have to cut, what you can no longer plan for. This is not abstract inflation. This is anxiety stretched across millions of households. And when protests erupt, the risk isn't just arrest, it's violence. More than 20 people have already been killed. Families are grieving. Phones are hidden. Messages are whispered. Yet people still come out because when survival itself feels threatened, fear changes shape. This is where anger turns into resolve. When people believe the system protects insiders while exposing everyone else to pain, patience runs out. You stop asking for fixes. You start demanding change. If you're one of those watching, wondering whether this will fade, ask yourself one thing. What incentive does the system offer right now for calm? And if you feel this story matters, don't look away. Because what's happening inside Iran is no longer contained. It's beginning to spill outward. What's happening inside Iran doesn't stop at its borders. It never does. Iran sits at the center of energy routes, regional security calculations, and long-running rivalries that stretch from the Middle East to global markets. When Iran weakens, shockwaves travel fast. Oil prices become more sensitive, shipping lanes feel the tension, regional actors recalibrate their risks. With fewer allies left, Tehran's ability to project power has narrowed. That creates openings for rivals, but also instability. A cornered state behaves differently than a confident one. Miscalculations become more likely, red lines blur, and every external move is now interpreted through the lens of internal fragility. At the same time, Washington's posture matters. Public warnings during active protests send signals not just to Tehran, but to allies, adversaries, and markets. They suggest a willingness to escalate or at least to test limits, that uncertainty alone is destabilizing. Add in Israel's security calculations, weakened proxy networks, and disrupted oil finance channels, and the picture sharpens. This is no longer a regional story. It's a global stress test. And when multiple powers start watching the same pressure point, the next phase becomes unpredictable. Which brings us to the question everyone is asking, quietly or out loud. What happens next? There are 3 paths forward from here. None of them are simple, and all of them carry real consequences. The first is the best-case scenario. Protests lose momentum without triggering a violent rupture. The state regains control through a mix of repression and limited economic adjustments. Inflation remains high. Legitimacy remains damaged, but the system survives. Stability returns on the surface, while pressure continues to build underneath. This is the path of delay, not resolution. The second is a middle scenario. Protests persist, spreading unevenly. Security forces fracture under sustained pressure. Elite divisions widen quietly. The system holds, but only by consuming itself. Governance becomes more reactive, more coercive, less predictable. Iran remains intact, but weaker, more volatile, and increasingly isolated. The third is the worst-case scenario. Internal unrest intersects with an external shock, a miscalculation, a strike, a sudden economic cutoff. In that moment, control slips faster than expected. Institutions fail to respond in unison. And the collapse is not orderly. It is chaotic, contested, and dangerous for Iranians first, but not only. History shows that systems rarely fall when they are strong. They fall when pressure converges. Iran is approaching that convergence. And that leaves one final question. What does this moment actually mean? Moments like this don't announce themselves as turning points. They arrive disguised as another protest, another warning, another crisis, layered on top of the last. But history has a way of revealing fractures only after they widen beyond repair. For decades, Iran's leadership argued that sacrifice today would guarantee security tomorrow, that endurance would be rewarded, that pressure from abroad would strengthen unity at home. What we're watching now suggests the opposite. The costs accumulated, the promises thinned, and the security once offered as the payoff now feels increasingly out of reach. With pressure rising from the streets and options shrinking abroad, the system is being tested in the only way that truly matters: legitimacy. Not slogans, not force, but whether people still believe the future inside this structure is worth enduring the present. If you're trying to understand where Iran goes next, don't focus on a single protest or a single speech. Watch the intersections. Economic pain, elite capture, external pressure. When those lines cross, change becomes possible and dangerous. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, share it. Stay with me, because the story of Iran is not ending here. It's entering its most unpredictable chapter yet,